In this presentation, I look at how sacred texts and translation contributed to the global spread of Gauḍīya Vaiṣṇavism, a Kṛṣṇa-centered devotional tradition within Hinduism. My focus is on the work of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda between 1965 and 1977. From this point on, I'll refer to him simply as Prabhupada. The question behind this presentation is quite simple. What happens when a religious tradition moves beyond its original language, culture, and institutions? Of course, a tradition may spread through travel, public teaching, visible religious activity, communities, and institutions, but it also spreads through texts. Sacred texts preserve doctrine, but in global religious movements, they may also become practical instruments of transmission. They carry authority, they shape communal identity, they provide shared vocabulary, and in this way, they help make a tradition teachable in new cultural contexts. This question connects to a wider discussion in religious studies about how religions become global or transnational. Some scholars, such as Thomas Csordas and Peggy Levitt, have looked at how religion moves across borders through social and institutional networks. Work on religious translation, including that of Jakobus Node, adds another important dimension by drawing attention to the movements of sacred texts across languages and cultural contexts. My presentation brings these concerns together by focusing on textual mediation. I use this term for the process through which sacred texts, once translated, commented upon, published, and distributed, become active instruments in the movement of a religious tradition. The case I examine is the mission of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda, the founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON. His mission had many visible dimensions. He traveled widely, taught publicly, founded temples, and organized religious practice. But in this presentation, I focus on one particular aspect of that wider mission, the way he translated and presented selected Sanskrit and Bengali Gaudiya Vaishnava scriptures. My central argument is that these translations and commentaries were not secondary to the mission. They were one of the main ways the mission became transmissible, authoritative, and global. Through his work, inherited Gaudiya Vaishnava sources became accessible to new readers. They also became authoritative for new practitioners and usable within a growing global movement beyond their original cultural setting. To understand this argument, we first need a brief orientation to the tradition Prabhupada represented. Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a devotional Hindu tradition centered on Krishna, who is understood as the Supreme Person. The word Gaudiya refers to Bengal in India, and the tradition is closely associated with Chaitanya, a 16th century religious teacher who is understood by Gaudiya Vaishnavas as a manifestation of Krishna. Chaitanya and his followers place particular emphasis on bhakti, loving devotion to God, at the center of religious life. This devotion was expressed especially through the chanting of Krishna's names. It was also shaped by a deeply personal understanding of the relationship between the individual soul and God. Two features of the tradition are especially important for my argument. The first is its relationship to sacred texts. Gaudiya Vaishnavism accepts the broader body of Vedic literature as authoritative, and it understands its own theology within that larger scriptural world. The second feature is the importance of commentary and transmission. Sacred texts are not treated as isolated texts. They are received through teachers, explained through commentaries, and passed on through disciplic lineages. In other words, authority lies not only in the text itself, but also in the way the text is understood and transmitted. This is important because Prabhupada did not present himself as an independent religious author. He worked within an inherited tradition of scriptural transmission. His task, as he understood it, was to make the tradition intelligible and practically applicable to audiences beyond India and eventually across the world. When we think about religious expansion, we usually notice the visible forms first, the journeys, the lectures, the temples, the rituals, and the communities. And these were certainly important in Prabhupada's mission. But a religious tradition also needs something that can outlast the physical presence of the teacher. It needs forms that can be preserved, circulated, and returned to again and again. In Prabhupada's case, this function was performed above all by books. By textual mediation, I mean that texts do more than transmit information. They help establish how a tradition is interpreted, practiced, and passed on. For Prabhupada, books were one of the main ways in which oral teaching became durable. A lecture reaches the people who are present at that moment. A journey brings the teacher to a particular place. A temple creates a local center of practice. But a book crosses these limits. A book can reach people who never met the teacher. It can be studied, quoted, distributed, and translated again. This became especially important after 1965, when Prabhupada began to establish the tradition outside its original Indian setting. The question was how Gaudiya Vaishnava teaching could become stable, repeatable, and intelligible for people who had not inherited its languages, concepts, or ritual world. His translations and commentaries responded to this need. They created a shared textual reference point for a movement that was expanding very quickly. This brings us to the question of selection. Prabhupada did not choose texts from a small or simple library. He worked within the vast world of Vedic and Vaishnava literature, where many texts are revered, interpreted, and used in different ways. So his selection mattered. He gave priority to a small number of works that could present Gaudiya Vaishnava theology in a coherent form for a new international audience. 3 works are especially important here: the Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. The Bhagavad Gita offered a compact entrance point. It is one of the best-known Sanskrit religious texts, and it presents the central questions of spiritual life: how to act, who we are, and how the individual being relates to God. The Srimad Bhagavatam, or Bhagavata Purana, opened a much broader theological and narrative world. For the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, it is a central source for understanding bhakti, sacred history, and Krishna's supreme position. The Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita added the distinctive Gaudiya dimension. It connected the scriptural world of the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam to Chaitanya and his followers, showing how this theology became a lived religious tradition. Together, these 3 works created a coherent textual structure: philosophical foundations, theological and narrative depth, and distinctive Gaudiya expression. This is where the concept of canon becomes useful, if used carefully. Prabhupada did not create the authority of these scriptures. They already belonged to the inherited sacred world of the tradition. What he did was to choose certain texts from a much larger sacred corpus, give them central importance, translate and comment upon them, and disseminate them in a form that could serve a new historical situation. In this sense, his work may be understood as canon formation in a missionary context. He was shaping an authoritative textual body for a transnational religious community. This also meant shaping a shared vocabulary. New practitioners did not simply receive general religious ideas in English. They learned to understand themselves and their practice through key Sanskrit and Gaudiya Vaishnava terms, which became part of the movement's common language. English played a crucial role in this process. Through Prabhupada's translations and commentaries, a tradition that had developed in Sanskrit and Bengali intellectual and devotional contexts first became widely accessible in English. From there, his followers translated these texts into many further languages. So the movement of these books was not only geographical, it was linguistic, conceptual, and institutional. Prabhupada's translations helped construct a portable scriptural architecture for a global devotional movement. The next question is how these texts were made available to readers outside their original linguistic and cultural setting. In Prabhupada's case, translation functioned as cultural and theological mediation. It carried concepts, practices, and forms of religious authority into a new context. This was demanding because many key terms do not have exact English equivalents. Words such as bhakti, dharma, guru, shastra, karma, or Krishna himself carry meanings that are deeply embedded in the tradition. If they are translated too loosely, their specific meaning is weakened. If they are left untranslated, the reader may feel excluded. Prabhupada often used both strategies together. He translated key ideas into English while retaining important Sanskrit terms and gradually teaching the reader how to understand them. In this way, the reader was introduced in the conceptual vocabulary of the tradition. The commentary is central here. In Prabhupada's books, the verse anchors the book in scripture. The translation opens the meaning, and the commentary carries out much of the mediation. It shows how the text is understood within the Gaudiya Vaisṇava tradition and why it matters for readers in a modern, non-Indian context. This reflects the wider role of commentary in the broader Sanskrit and Vaishnava traditions. Commentary does not simply explain difficult words. It preserves a recognized line of interpretation. It draws out the theological conclusions of the text and shows how scripture is to be received and practiced. This was especially important because his intended readers often did not share the cultural assumptions of the original texts. They might not know what karma meant in this tradition, why Krishna was approached as God, or why practices such as chanting and worship were central. The commentaries addressed these gaps. They explained unfamiliar concepts and practices while presenting Gaudiya Vaisṇava teachings as relevant beyond one region of India. Prabhupada framed them as a body of knowledge concerned with universal questions: identity, suffering, desire, moral responsibility, social order, and the relationship between the individual being and God. This is where translation becomes cultural transfer. Prabhupada's books preserved a traditional Gaudiya Vaisṇava framework while making it intelligible in a new setting. Through translation and commentary, he gave readers more than access to texts. He gave them a way to understand the doctrine, enter the practice, and learn the vocabulary of the tradition. The next step is to see how books became institutionally active. Prabhupada's books did not remain private reading material. They became part of the practical structure of ISKCON. In the emerging movement, these books were read, studied, distributed, and translated further. They gave practitioners access to doctrine and shared language through which they could understand themselves as members of a tradition. This was important because ISKCON developed rapidly across different geographical and cultural settings. The books created a common textual center. They helped devotees in different parts of the world refer to the same texts, explanations, and theological framework. In this way, Prabhupada's books contributed to doctrinal coherence. They helped stabilize what the movement taught, what it considered authoritative, and how it interpreted its practices. The institutional role became clear with the establishment of the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, or BBT, in 1972. The BBT was not simply a publishing house in a commercial sense. It gave organizational form to the conviction that the production and dissemination of books were central to the mission. For the study of religious globalization, this is significant because geographical expansion requires mechanisms of continuity. Teachings must be preserved across time, distance, language, and generational change. Prabhupada's book served this function during his lifetime and continued to do so after his death in 1977. The textual corpus therefore gave ISKCON a portable center. Scriptural authority, mediated through translation and commentary, became the foundation of its global institutional identity. What then does this case contribute to religious studies more broadly? It brings together questions that are often treated separately: how religions globalize, how sacred texts are translated, how canons are formed, and how movements become institutionalized. In Prabhupada's work, translation, commentary, publication, and dissemination operated together as mechanisms through which a religious tradition became transnational. Translation made inherited sources linguistically accessible. Commentaries made them interpretively accessible. Publication made them materially available, and distribution made them socially mobile. This case also helps us ask, how does authority travel when the teacher is not present? And how do teachings become repeatable across distance? How does a tradition become intelligible to new audiences while remaining connected to inherited sources? It shows that sacred texts can train interpretation, stabilize doctrine, and connect local practice to a transnational whole. Texts do not act alone. They work with institutions, teachers, and rituals, readers, and communities. But they should not be treated as passive containers of religious ideas. They can become instruments through which religious worlds are carried, reinterpreted, and reproduced. To conclude, Prabhupada's translations and commentaries show how sacred texts can move across linguistic, geographical, communal, and institutional boundaries. His books carried Gaudiya Vaisṇava doctrine and created the conditions under which that doctrine could be taught and practiced outside India and then reproduced in new settings. They gave the emerging movement a scriptural center, a vocabulary, an interpretive framework, and a durable form of authority. The case also shows that continuity and adaptation can work together. Prabhupada's translations and commentaries claimed continuity with inherited Gaudiya Vaisṇava sources, while making those sources intelligible and usable in new cultural settings. In this sense, Prabhupada's translations were not simply texts about Gaudiya Vaishnavism. They became one of the principal means through which Gaudiya Vaishnavism itself traveled. Thank you for your kind attention.